You told me the boys' futures were secured. You're a fraud, his ex-wife screamed through the phone. I simply stood in my quiet kitchen, listening to the man who called my 7-year-old daughter a financial burden lose his entire empire. Have you ever poured your whole heart into building a family, only to realize you and your child were just a convenient afterthought? Share your experiences in the comments below, and please subscribe to hear the full story. The hardest part wasn't taking my power back, it was accepting the harsh reality of how little we actually meant to him. The illusion finally shattered the day he packed his bags for Europe. My boys get the trust funds. Your daughter gets nothing. That's final. My husband, Richard, shrugged. He didn't even look at me as he carefully folded a designer polo shirt, placing it into his leather weekend bag. He was packing for a 2-week vacation to Europe, a vacation with his ex-wife Sarah and their 2 teenage sons. I stood in the doorway of our master bedroom, the afternoon sun casting long, cold shadows across the hardwood floor. My chest tightened, a familiar, dull ache spreading through my ribs, but I forced my face to remain entirely impassive. For 5 years, I had poured my heart into this blended family. I had cooked, cleaned, tutored his boys, and loved them as my own. Yet, in Richard's eyes, my 7-year-old daughter, Mia, was just an afterthought, a financial burden he barely tolerated. She's not my blood, he had casually mentioned to his lawyer on the phone last night, unaware I was listening. Set up the trusts for the boys, only. Now, watching him hum a cheerful tune as he zipped up his luggage, the last fragile string holding my marriage together quietly snapped. I didn't yell. I didn't fall to my knees and beg him to reconsider, to see Mia's worth, or to value the sacrifices I had made. The tears that would have blinded me a year ago were nowhere to be found. Instead, there was just a cold, heavy clarity. I walked over to my bedside table, my hand perfectly steady, and picked up a single, crisp envelope. Inside was a notarized bank receipt. "Here," I said softly, holding it out to him. "Give this to your accountant later." Richard glanced at the white envelope in my hand, an amused smirk playing on his lips. He probably thought it was a grocery bill, or perhaps the receipt for Mia's upcoming ballet lessons, expenses he always complained about paying. He took it without a second thought, slipping it casually into the front pocket of his carry-on bag. "Sure, whatever you say, Maya," he muttered, checking his expensive wristwatch. "I really need to get going. The flight leaves at 5 p.m., and Sarah hates it when I'm late to the terminal." Hearing him prioritize his ex-wife's schedule over our marriage should have hurt. Once upon a time, it would have shattered me. When we first got married, Richard painted a beautiful picture of a united family. He promised that Mia would never feel left out, that his sons, Ethan and Lucas, would be the big brothers she always wanted. But the reality was a slow, agonizing drip of marginalization. When Ethan got a brand new car for his 16th birthday, Mia was told her request for a new bicycle was too extravagant this month. Whenever Sarah called demanding Richard's time or money for their boys, he dropped everything. I became the silent manager of his household, the invisible glue holding his chaotic life together, while he funneled every spare ounce of his energy and wealth toward his past. I watched him grab his jacket, his face glowing with anticipation for the trip. He was leaving me and Mia behind for 2 weeks over the summer holidays, claiming it was a crucial bonding experience for his sons that didn't require our presence. He had no idea that this goodbye was permanent. After the front door clicked shut, the house fell into a deafening silence. I walked into the kitchen, the scent of Richard's expensive cologne still lingering in the hallway. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee and sat at the island, staring out the window at the swing set I had built for Mia last summer. Richard hadn't lifted a finger to help me assemble it. He had been too busy taking his boys to a luxury golf resort. The blatant inequality had been eating away at my soul for years. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the message the money sent. It told Mia every single day that she was second best. It told me that my contributions were worthless. What Richard conveniently forgot, however, was the origin of his current lifestyle. When we met, his consulting firm was on the brink of bankruptcy. His divorce from Sarah had bled him dry. It was my silent investment, the inheritance my late father left me, that had bailed out his company. I had quietly infused the capital under a holding company, letting Richard believe his sudden turnaround was due to a mysterious angel investor who believed in his genius. I never wanted the credit. I only wanted a stable, loving home for my daughter. I had signed a postnuptial agreement at his insistence to protect his boy's future, waiving my rights to his company's direct profits. But I had kept the holding company entirely in my name. For 5 years, I let him play the wealthy patriarch. Now, he was cutting my daughter out of the very empire my family's money had built. Mia padded into the kitchen, her bare feet making soft slapping sounds against the tiles. She was rubbing her sleepy eyes, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. "Is Daddy Richard gone?" she asked, her voice tinged with a confusing mix of relief and disappointment. My heart ached for her. Even at 7, she was incredibly perceptive. She knew Richard wasn't her real father, but she had tried so hard to win his affection. She had drawn him countless pictures that ended up in the recycling bin, and learned to be completely silent when his boys were over, so she wouldn't disturb their peace. "Yes, sweetie," I said, pulling her onto my lap and burying my face in her soft hair. "Are we still going to the park today?" she asked, looking up at me with wide, hopeful eyes. "Absolutely," I smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through my chest. "Just you and me. We're going to have the best summer ever." As I held her, my mind drifted back to the notarized receipt currently sitting in Richard's carry-on. A week ago, after I overheard his conversation with the estate lawyer, I made a call to my wealth manager. The instructions were simple and legally watertight. I executed the clawback clause in the original investment contract, a clause Richard's sloppy lawyers had completely overlooked. It allowed the holding company to withdraw its principal investment and accumulated interest immediately if certain fiduciary conditions were breached. By transferring company assets into personal trusts for his sons without board approval, Richard had triggered the trap. I had drained the accounts legally, cleanly, and completely. The afternoon stretched on, peaceful and entirely ours. I packed a picnic basket with Mia's favorite sandwiches, and we headed to the local botanical gardens. The sun was shining, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the crushing weight of walking on eggshells. I wasn't checking my phone every 5 minutes to see if Richard needed me to run an errand for his boys, or bracing myself for one of Sarah's demanding phone calls that always ruined our weekends. I was simply present with my daughter. Around 2:30 p.m., I imagined Richard arriving at the airport, strutting toward the premium check-in desk to meet his ex-wife. He was probably planning to order a glass of expensive champagne in the lounge, toasting to a stress-free European vacation. He had no idea that the credit cards tied to his primary business accounts were currently being flagged, frozen one by one, as the banks realized the underlying collateral had completely vanished. I had timed it perfectly. The withdrawal had been finalized at 9 a.m. The automated alerts wouldn't reach his accountant until mid-afternoon, just as Richard would be connecting through the major international hub at Terminal 4. He was flying blindly into a hurricane of his own making. As Mia laughed, chasing a bright blue butterfly across the manicured lawns, I felt a profound sense of peace. I wasn't acting out of malice or revenge. I was acting out of survival and self-respect. I was reclaiming the future that belonged to my daughter, the future he had so callously tried to steal. I checked my watch. It was 3 p.m., only 45 minutes left until he opened that envelope. By 3:15 p.m., Mia and I had returned home. She was exhausted from the sun and fell asleep on the couch, her little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. I sat in the armchair opposite her, a cup of herbal tea warming my hands. The silence of the house felt different now. It wasn't the lonely, oppressive silence of waiting for a husband who preferred to be elsewhere. It was the expansive, comforting silence of a sanctuary. My phone lay on the coffee table, its screen dark and quiet. I knew Richard wouldn't try to call me while navigating the airport. He made it a point to ignore my messages when he was with Sarah and the boys, claiming he needed to be present for them. The hypocrisy of it used to keep me awake at night. How could he demand presence for his past family while completely abandoning his current one? I took a sip of my tea, feeling the warmth travel down my throat. I had spent years trying to prove my worth to a man who had already decided I was a glorified placeholder. I had organized Sarah's frantic schedule, bought the boys Christmas presents, and signed Richard's name, and smiled through gritted teeth when he called Mia your kid instead of ours. No more. The notarized receipt in his bag was more than just a financial statement. It was my resignation letter from a life of emotional servitude. The holding company had officially severed all ties with his firm. He was entirely on his own now, armed only with the inflated ego he had built on my dime. At 3:30 p.m., my phone finally buzzed. It wasn't Richard. It was Marcus, my wealth manager, sending a brief, encrypted text message. The withdrawal has cleared entirely. The corporate accounts associated with the secondary firm are now registering negative balances due to pending auto drafts. His accountant has just accessed the portal. I read the message twice, my heart giving a slight, nervous flutter. There was no going back now. The gears of consequence were fully in motion. I typed back a simple, "Thank you, Marcus. Proceed with the Asset Protection Trust for Mia." I set the phone down and let out a long, shaky breath. A part of me, the part that had loved Richard so fiercely in the beginning, felt a twinge of sorrow. I had never wanted it to end this way. I had wanted a partner, a true teammate. But he had forced my hand. He had drawn a line in the sand, placing his wealth and his loyalty firmly on the side of his previous marriage, leaving Mia standing in the cold. I looked over at my sleeping daughter. Her innocent face, relaxed in slumber, solidified my resolve. I was a mother first. I would gladly play the villain in Richard's story if it meant protecting the hero in Mia's. The clock on the wall ticked forward, 3:40 p.m. He would be at the international terminal now, likely heading to the first-class lounge during their wait. I imagined him reaching into his carry-on for his passport or his premium credit card. His fingers would brush against that crisp, white envelope. Terminal 4 of the international airport was notoriously busy, a sprawling expanse of high-end boutiques and crowded gates. I knew the layout well from the few business trips I had accompanied Richard on before Mia was born. He liked the prestige of the upper-level lounges, where he could sip scotch and network. It was 3:45 p.m. I closed my eyes, visualizing the scene. According to the timeline Marcus and I had anticipated, Richard's accountant, panicking over the sudden catastrophic drain of company funds, would be frantically calling him right now. But Richard, ever dismissive, would likely ignore the call, annoyed at the interruption to his vacation. Or perhaps, looking for a pen to fill out a customs form, he would finally pull out the envelope I had given him. The envelope didn't contain a grocery bill. It contained the notarized receipt of a bank transfer out of his firm's holding account, totaling the exact amount of my initial investment plus 5 years of compounded interest. Attached to it was a brief legal notice terminating our silent partnership. The numbers printed on that paper represented the entirety of his liquid assets. Without them, the trust funds he had so proudly set up for his boys that morning were nothing but empty folders. The vacation he was embarking on was entirely unfunded. The luxury life he paraded in front of Sarah was instantly bankrupt. I opened my eyes, staring at the ceiling of my quiet living room. The execution was silent, bloodless, and entirely legal. It happened exactly at 3:47 p.m. My phone began to vibrate violently on the glass coffee table, the jarring noise shattering the peace of the living room. The caller ID flashed Richard's face, a a smiling, arrogant photo from a gala we had attended last year. I didn't pick up. I simply watched it ring, the device trembling against the glass like a trapped insect. It rang until it went to voicemail, then immediately started ringing again and again. The sheer desperation in the rapid succession of calls told me everything I needed to know. He had opened the envelope. He had spoken to his accountant. The illusion was broken. I imagined him dropping to his knees in the middle of Terminal 4, the bustling crowds of travelers blurring past him. I pictured the color draining from his face as his eyes scanned the notarized receipt, the zeros lined up like a firing squad against his ego. I pictured Sarah standing next to him with her designer luggage, looking annoyed at his sudden change in demeanor, completely unaware that the man she thought was a financial titan was now effectively penniless. For years, he had used money as a weapon to control me, to elevate his sons, and to belittle my daughter. He thought he held all the cards because I played my hand so quietly. He had mistaken my silence for weakness, my patience for submission. As the phone rang for the 5th time, I finally reached out and swiped the screen, rejecting the call. I then opened my settings and calmly blocked his number. With Richard's number blocked, a profound stillness settled over the house once more. I walked over to the mantel and picked up a framed photograph of our family. It was taken last Christmas. Richard, Sarah, and their 2 boys were front and center, laughing by the tree. I was standing slightly to the side, holding a somber-looking Mia, looking more like the hired help than the lady of the house. I slid the back off the frame, pulled the photo out, and dropped it into the wastebasket. It was time to clear out the ghosts. The first part of my plan was complete. I had severed the financial arteries that gave Richard his power. But the emotional untangling had just begun. He would eventually find a way to contact me. He would rage, he would threaten, and when that failed, he might even try to beg. I needed to be ready for the fallout. I walked back into the kitchen and pulled out a fresh, empty box from the pantry. I started opening cabinets, systematically pulling out Richard's expensive protein powders, his specific brand of imported coffee, the gourmet snacks he hoarded for his sons. I tossed them all into the box. I was reclaiming my space, shelf by shelf. This house was in my name, purchased long before I ever met him. It was Mia's home. As I wiped down the newly emptied counters, I felt a spark of genuine excitement for the future. For the first time in a long time, I was the author of my own story. Outside, the afternoon sky had darkened considerably, and a heavy, rhythmic rain began to fall. I stood by the large living room window, watching the steady downpour. The sound of the droplets hitting the glass patio doors was incredibly soothing, washing over the house in a continuous, calming loop. I focused on the tiny water ripples forming in the puddles on the driveway, feeling entirely anchored in the present moment. For years, I had dreaded rainy days because it meant Richard would be stuck indoors, pacing the halls, complaining about canceled golf games, and snapping at Mia for simply breathing too loudly. Today, the rain felt like a baptism. It felt like the house was finally exhaling. Mia stirred on the couch behind me, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. "Mommy, is it raining?" she mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "Yes, baby," I smiled, turning away from the window to look at her. "It's a perfect afternoon for a movie and some hot cocoa. How does that sound?" Her face lit up instantly. "With the little marshmallows?" "With all the marshmallows," I promised, walking over to kiss her forehead. As I headed toward the kitchen to put the kettle on, my gaze fell upon the landline phone mounted on the wall. I had blocked Richard's number on my cell, but in my pursuit of peace, I had completely forgotten about the house phone. Almost as if on cue, the shrill ring echoed through the quiet kitchen. I paused, my hand hovering over the kettle. I knew exactly who was on the other end, but to my surprise, the caller ID didn't display Richard's name. It displayed Sarah's. I stared at the blinking caller ID, taking a deep breath before lifting the receiver. Hello? I answered, my voice steady and calm. Maya, what on earth is wrong with your husband's accounts? Sarah's voice blasted through the speaker, sharp and accusatory. There was no agreeing, no polite preamble, just the usual entitlement. In the background, I could hear the distinct, echoing announcements of the airport terminal. Hello, Sarah, I replied softly. Don't hello, Sarah me. We are standing at the premium check-in desk, and Richard's black card just declined, twice. The agent is looking at us like we're criminals, and Richard is hyperventilating in a chair by the baggage drop. Did you forget to authorize the international travel alerts again? I told him he shouldn't leave the administrative tasks to you. I closed my eyes, a wry smile touching my lips. Even now, facing public humiliation, her first instinct was to blame me for failing to manage Richard's life perfectly. She truly believed I was nothing more than Richard's disorganized secretary. I didn't forget anything, Sarah, I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. The cards declined because there are no funds attached to them anymore. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of the airport seemed to amplify. What do you mean, no funds? Richard is a managing partner. He just set up the boys' trust funds this morning. He set up empty accounts, I corrected her gently. The money he thought he had was withdrawn by the holding company earlier today. A holding company? What holding company? Sarah demanded, her voice dropping an octave, shifting from anger to genuine confusion. I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to the rain continue its steady rhythm against the roof. The holding company that has been entirely funding Richard's firm for the last 5 years, the one I own. I executed a legal clawback clause this morning. Richard's business is effectively bankrupt, Sarah. The money is gone. I could hear Richard's frantic voice in the background now, muffled but unmistakably panicked. Give me the phone, Sarah. Don't talk to her. Maya, if you can hear me. Sarah didn't hand the phone over. Her breathing grew shallow over the receiver. You're lying. Richard rebuilt that firm himself. He told me he secured a silent investor after our divorce. I was the investor, Sarah. My father's inheritance saved him, and today I took it back. Why? She gasped, the reality finally beginning to pierce through her aristocratic facade. Because last night, I listened to my husband tell his lawyer that my daughter is nothing but a financial burden and that only his blood deserved security, I explained, the emotional weight of those words still stinging, but no longer possessing the power to break me. I realized I was funding a man who despised my child. I'm a mother, Sarah. Surely you understand. The line went dead silent, save for the static of the connection. For years, Sarah had reveled in the luxurious lifestyle Richard provided her post-divorce, never questioning where the sudden influx of wealth came from. Now, she was realizing that the lifestyle she felt so entitled to had been quietly subsidized by the woman she constantly looked down upon. A holding company? What holding company? Sarah demanded, her voice dropping an octave, shifting from anger to genuine confusion. I leaned against the kitchen counter, listening to the rain continue its steady rhythm against the roof. The holding company that has been entirely funding Richard's firm for the last 5 years, the one I own. I executed a legal clawback clause this morning. Richard's business is effectively bankrupt, Sarah. The money is gone. I could hear Richard's frantic voice in the background now, muffled but unmistakably panicked. Give me the phone, Sarah. Don't talk to her. Maya, if you can hear me. Sarah didn't hand the phone over. Her breathing grew shallow over the receiver. You're lying. Richard rebuilt that firm himself. He told me he secured a silent investor after our divorce. I was the investor, Sarah. My father's inheritance saved him, and today I took it back. Why? She gasped, the reality finally beginning to pierce through her aristocratic facade. Because last night, I listened to my husband tell his lawyer that my daughter is nothing but a financial burden and that only his blood deserved security, I explained, the emotional weight of those words still stinging, but no longer possessing the power to break me. I realized I was funding a man who despised my child. I'm a mother, Sarah. Surely you understand. The line went dead silent, save for the static of the connection. For years, Sarah had reveled in the luxurious lifestyle Richard provided her post-divorce, never questioning where the sudden influx of wealth came from. Now, she was realizing that the lifestyle she felt so entitled to had been quietly subsidized by the woman she constantly looked down upon. The following morning, the storm had passed, leaving the neighborhood looking vibrant and freshly washed. The air was crisp, and sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. At 9 a.m. sharp, my lawyer, Helen, arrived at the house. We sat at the dining room table, surrounded by neat stacks of paperwork. Helen was a formidable woman, sharp and incredibly efficient. I had retained her services months ago, slowly preparing for this exact scenario, though I had hoped I would never have to push the button. The withdrawal is fully documented and legally unassailable, Helen confirmed, sliding a thick folder toward me. His firm's accounts are frozen. The Asset Protection Trust for Mia is now active and entirely insulated from any marital disputes, which brings us to the final step. She placed a single document in front of me, the petition for dissolution of marriage. Because the house was purchased prior to the marriage and remained solely in your name, and because of the ironclad post-nuptial agreement Richard insisted you sign to protect his assets, Helen said, her lips twitching in a rare, ironic smile, he has absolutely no claim to this property or your recovered investments. I stared at the divorce papers. It felt surreal. 5 years of marriage, of trying to mold myself into the perfect, accommodating wife, reduced to a few signatures on a page. I picked up the pen, my hand remarkably steady. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt liberated. I signed my name on the dotted line, legally reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my daughter's future. It took Richard 2 full days to show up at the house. I was in the front yard, helping Mia plant a small row of marigolds by the porch, when a battered yellow taxi pulled into the driveway. The contrast was jarring. Richard usually drove a sleek, imported sports car, a car that was now undoubtedly repossessed or locked away in a frozen corporate garage. He stepped out of the taxi, and I barely recognized him. He looked like he had aged 10 years. His expensive European haircut was disheveled. The designer polo shirt he had packed so carefully was rumpled and stained, and dark circles hollowed out his eyes. He lugged his leather weekend bag over his shoulder, looking thoroughly defeated. "Mia, sweetie," I said softly, keeping my eyes on Richard. "Why don't you go inside and wash your hands? I need to speak with Richard for a moment." "Okay, Mommy," she chirped, obediently dropping her plastic trowel and running inside. The front door clicked shut, leaving Richard and me alone on the freshly manicured lawn. He stopped at the edge of the porch, looking up at me. He didn't have a key. I had changed the locks the moment I signed the divorce papers. "Maya," he breathed, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "Please, let me inside. We need to talk about this. You've completely destroyed me." I stood on the porch steps, looking down at the man I had once loved. "I didn't destroy you, Richard. I just stopped paying for your illusions." "You don't understand what you've done," Richard pleaded, taking a step closer, though he wisely didn't try to ascend the porch stairs. "Sarah took the boys and went to her mother's house. The partners at the firm are threatening to sue me for fiduciary negligence. My credit is ruined. I have nothing, Maya." "You have exactly what you brought into this marriage," I replied calmly. "Nothing." He ran a trembling hand through his hair, attempting to muster a shred of his old, manipulative charm. "Maya, listen to me. I was stressed. The pressure of the business, Sarah constantly demanding things for the boys. I misspoke. That conversation with the lawyer, you took it entirely out of context." "Out of context?" I repeated, a cold laugh escaping my lips. "Richard, you explicitly told your lawyer to exclude my daughter from any financial security because she isn't your blood. You packed your bags to go on a luxury vacation with your ex-wife using my money, while leaving me and Mia here like discarded luggage. There is no context in the world that makes that acceptable. I was going to set something up for Mia later. He lied smoothly, though his eyes darted away from mine. You just overreacted. If you just transfer the funds back, we can fix this. I'll fire the lawyer. I'll make you an equal partner at the firm. I don't want to be your partner, Richard, and I don't want to fix this. I looked at him, feeling a wave of profound pity. He still thought he could negotiate his way out of a moral bankruptcy. He still thought I was the naive, desperate woman he had married. "You're being vindictive," Richard snapped, a flash of his true, arrogant temper finally breaking through his pathetic facade. "You planned this. You deliberately humiliated me in front of Sarah and the boys. You stole my company." "It was never your company," I corrected him, my voice devoid of emotion. "It was my capital, my risk, and my safety net. You were just the face on the brochure." And as for being vindictive, no, Richard. Vindictive would be telling your sons the truth about why their father can't afford their tuition next semester. Vindictive would be exposing you to your wealthy country club friends. He swallowed hard, the anger draining from his face as quickly as it had arrived, replaced once again by sheer panic. "I'm simply enforcing boundaries," I continued. "You made your priorities incredibly clear. Your boys get the trust funds. My daughter gets nothing. That was your final word. I respected it. I just ensured that the trust funds were funded by your money, not mine." He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. There was no loophole, no charm offensive that could undo this. He had gambled his entire life on the assumption that my love was unconditional and blind to his cruelty. He had lost everything because he couldn't see the value of the family standing right in front of him. "Where am I supposed to go?" he whispered, his voice incredibly small. "That is no longer my concern," I told him gently. I turned and opened the front door, reaching into the entryway. I pulled out a heavy, sealed cardboard box and pushed it across the threshold onto the porch. Then I pulled out a second box. "What is this?" he asked, staring at the cartons. "Your remaining personal items. Clothes, watches, your golf clubs are around back." "And this," I said, picking up a sleek manila envelope from the top of the first box and holding it out to him. "These are the divorce papers. My lawyer has already filed them with the county clerk." Richard didn't move to take the envelope. He just stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "Maya, please, I'm begging you. Don't throw 5 years away. I love you. I love Mia. We can go to counseling. We can be a real family." "We were a real family, Richard. You just forgot to show up for it." I dropped the envelope onto the top of the box. I looked at him one last time, searching my heart for any lingering attachment, any shred of doubt. There was nothing, just empty space where a heavy burden used to sit. "Goodbye, Richard. Do not contact me again. If you have any questions about the settlement, direct them to my attorney." I stepped back inside the house and firmly pulled the heavy wooden door shut, the deadbolt engaged with a satisfying final click. I stood in the foyer for a moment, listening. Through the thick wood, I could hear the faint sound of Richard sobbing on the porch. It was a pathetic, broken sound, but it didn't move me. I didn't peek through the curtains. I didn't second-guess my decision. I simply turned my back to the door and walked away. I found Mia in the kitchen, carefully washing her hands at the sink, standing on her little step stool. She looked over her shoulder, her face bright and unbothered. "Is Richard gone, Mommy?" she asked. "Yes, sweetie," I said, grabbing a towel to help her dry her hands. "He's gone, for good this time." "Oh," she said, pondering this information for a second. Then a massive smile spread across her face. "Does that mean we don't have to whisper in the mornings anymore?" Tears pricked the corners of my eyes, but they were tears of profound relief. I scooped her up into my arms, hugging her tightly against my chest. "No more whispering," I promised her, kissing her cheek. "From now on, we can be as loud as we want." The storm outside had completely passed, leaving behind a clear, bright sky. Our home was finally ours, free from the shadows of resentment and neglect. The toxic chapter of our lives had been firmly closed, and as I looked at my daughter's beaming face, I knew the best part of our story was just beginning. 6 months passed, and the changing of the seasons mirrored the profound shift within our home. Summer faded into a crisp, golden autumn, and with it went the last lingering shadows of Richard's presence. The house, once a museum of his expensive tastes and my silent compromises, had transformed into a vibrant sanctuary of our own making. In my journey to heal, I discovered an unexpected outlet for my voice, a voice I had suppressed for 5 long years. I converted Richard's old home office into a small, cozy recording studio. I purchased a high-quality studio microphone and began recording my experiences, shaping them into narrative-driven, podcast-style videos. I didn't want the spotlight or fame. I simply wanted to connect with other women who might be trapped in the same cycle of emotional neglect and financial manipulation. To maintain our privacy, I intentionally set up the camera angle to slightly obscure my face, letting the microphone and my voice take center stage. I spoke about the insidious nature of unequal partnerships, the heavy burden of being a silent financial provider, and the painful realization that a blended family only works if both parents are willing to blend their hearts, not just their assets. It was incredibly cathartic. Every evening after I tucked Mia into bed, I would sit at my desk, adjust the microphone, and simply talk. I poured all the unspoken grief, the years of tiptoeing around Richard's fragile ego, and the ultimate triumph of walking away, straight into the audio tracks. I was no longer the invisible wife hiding in the background. I was the author, the narrator, and the protagonist of my own reclaimed life. The creative process became my nightly therapy. I had downloaded a popular mobile editing app and taught myself the rhythms of video production. I spent hours cutting the footage, learning how to seamlessly merge audio with visuals to create a specific, calming atmosphere. Because the content of my stories was often heavy with emotional themes of betrayal and household conflict, I wanted the visual experience to be a refuge for my viewers. Instead of using my own face, I began pairing my audio narratives with high-quality, continuous looping videos of nature. I found beautiful, static camera footage of gentle rain falling on green leaves, or the mesmerizing, rhythmic ripples of water across a quiet pond. These atmospheric, almost ASMR-like background loops created a stunning contrast to the drama of the stories I was telling. It was a visual metaphor for the peace I had finally found. No matter how chaotic the memories of Richard were, the rain kept falling steadily, the water kept rippling, and the world kept turning. Mia loved watching me edit. She would sit beside me, her chin resting on my shoulder, fascinated by how a few taps on the screen could transform raw clips into a polished, looping masterpiece. Sometimes she would even record small audio introductions for me, her sweet, high-pitched voice proudly announcing, "Welcome to Mommy's Storytime." I wasn't making these videos for monetization or viral fame, though the channel steadily grew a quiet, dedicated following. I was making them to prove to myself that the pain hadn't been for nothing. I was taking the shattered pieces of my past and editing them into something beautiful, structured, and entirely within my control. Inevitably, the silence between Richard and me was briefly broken in late November. I walked to the mailbox one chilly morning to find a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing his unmistakable, overly flourishing handwriting. He had bypassed my lawyer and sent it directly to the house. I stood in the driveway, the cold wind biting at my cheeks, and stared at the letter. 6 months ago, my heart would have hammered in my chest. I would have felt a surge of anxiety, wondering what demands or accusations lay inside. Now, I felt nothing but a mild sense of curiosity. I took it inside, made myself a cup of tea, and sliced it open at the kitchen island. The letter was 5 pages long, filled with grandiose apologies and desperate pleas. He wrote about how Sarah had officially left him, taking the boys back to her hometown. He lamented the loss of his status, the humiliation of stepping down from his firm, and the crushing weight of his new reality. He claimed he had seen the light, that he realized I was the best thing that had ever happened to him. He begged for a meeting, just one chance to apologize to Mia, one chance to prove he could be the father he never was. As I read his words, I didn't feel a triumphant sense of vengeance. I felt a profound, heavy sadness for the man he had chosen to be. The apologies were beautifully written, but they were entirely hollow. He wasn't missing me. He was missing the safety net I provided. He wasn't grieving the loss of our family. He was grieving the loss of his lifestyle. I calmly folded the letter, walked to the home office, and fed it directly into the paper shredder. While Richard was suffocating under the collapse of his own pride, Mia was blossoming in ways I hadn't dared to hope for. Without the constant, oppressive energy of Richard's favoritism, her confidence soared. The ballet lessons Richard had so bitterly complained about funding became the highlight of her week. I enrolled her at the premier academy in the city, using the very funds I had legally clawed back from his empty empire. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I watched her twirl across the hardwood studio floors, her face radiant with pure, unadulterated joy. One evening, after practice, we were sitting on the living room floor, eating pizza from the box. Mia was still in her pink leotard, showing me a complex new position she had learned. "Mommy, do you think I'm getting better?" she asked, her eyes wide and earnest. "I think you are the most beautiful dancer in the entire world," I told her, wiping a smudge of tomato sauce from her cheek. She smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that reached her eyes. "I like it when it's just us," she said softly, leaning into my shoulder. "The house feels lighter, like a balloon." I hugged her tightly, burying my face in her hair. She had articulated perfectly what I had been feeling for months. We had dropped the dead weight. I realized then that my greatest success wasn't outsmarting Richard's lawyers or reclaiming my financial independence. My greatest success was protecting this little girl's spirit. I had shielded her from a man who viewed her as a deficit, and in doing so, I had given her the space to realize she was entirely enough, exactly as she was. Winter arrived with a quiet, breathtaking elegance. A heavy blanket of snow covered the neighborhood, transforming the streets into a pristine, white wonderland. The world outside felt muffled and still, perfectly mirroring the serenity inside our home. I sat at my desk, looking out the window at the gently falling snow. It was mesmerizing. I quickly grabbed my camera, set it up on a tripod facing the glass, and recorded an hour of the static, beautiful snowfall. It was the perfect, calming loop for my next video. Tonight, I was recording the final chapter of my personal story. I adjusted the studio microphone, took a deep breath, and began to speak into the quiet room. There is a distinct difference between surviving a storm and learning how to control the weather in your own mind, I said softly, the words flowing naturally. For years, I let someone else dictate my worth. I let a man partition my home, placing my daughter in the shadows while he illuminated his past. I thought patience was a virtue, but I learned that patience without boundaries is just self-destruction. I glanced at the monitor, watching the patio waves peak and dip with the cadence of my voice. The hardest part wasn't walking away. The hardest part was forgiving myself for staying as long as I did. But if I hadn't stayed, if I hadn't reached the absolute breaking point, I wouldn't have found the strength to rebuild this life. A life where my daughter knows her absolute value. I hit the stop button, a profound sense of closure washing over me. The story was finally out of my head and out in the world. The healing was complete. The final bureaucratic end to my marriage arrived on a bleak, gray Tuesday in late January. I met my lawyer, Helen, at the county courthouse. The imposing stone building felt cold, but I walked through the metal detectors with my head held high. We sat on a wooden bench outside the judge's chambers. Helen, ever the professional, handed me the final decree. He didn't contest a single clause, she informed me, her tone laced with quiet satisfaction. Without your capital, his firm couldn't afford the legal fees to drag this out. He accepted the reality of the post-nuptial agreement. The holding company, the recovered assets, and this house are entirely legally yours. I looked down at the paper, staring at the bold black stamp that read, "Dissolution of marriage granted." Did he show up? I asked, looking down the long, empty hallway. His court-appointed proxy filed the paperwork, Helen replied gently. He's relocated to a smaller apartment on the outskirts of the city. He's currently looking for entry-level consulting work. It seems the industry found out about his sudden lack of silent backing and the ensuing fallout with his partners. I nodded, feeling no malice, just a quiet acknowledgement of the universe's scales balancing themselves. He had tried to build a dynasty by exploiting my generosity and alienating my child. Now, he was starting over from scratch, armed only with the very things he had valued most, his ego and his pride, and they were proving to be very poor company. I thanked Helen, shaking her hand warmly. As I walked out of the courthouse and into the crisp winter air, I took my first true breath as a completely free woman. Returning home that afternoon, the house felt different once again. It wasn't just a sanctuary anymore, it was a fortress. I walked into the living room and looked at the space where Richard's expensive leather recliner used to sit. In its place, I had set up a beautiful reading nook for Mia, complete with a plush rug and overflowing bookshelves. I realized that true reconciliation doesn't always mean making peace with the person who hurt you. Sometimes the most important reconciliation is with yourself. I had to forgive the version of Maya who had signed checks to Richard's firm while her daughter was told to be quiet. I had to forgive the woman who had cried in the bathroom so her husband wouldn't see her weakness. That woman had done her best. She had played the long game, securing her daughter's future with the very post-nuptial agreement Richard had used to try and secure his own. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of wine. I raised it to the empty room, toasting a silent toast to my late father. The inheritance he had left me was meant to provide security, and for a while I had let it be used as a weapon against us. But in the end, my father's legacy had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had set us free. I took a sip, the warmth spreading through my chest. I had rewritten the narrative. I had changed the script of our lives, transforming a tragedy of emotional neglect into a story of absolute empowerment. The villain was gone, the hero had found her voice, and the true priority, Mia, was finally placed in the center of the frame. The culmination of our new life manifested in early March at Mia's first major ballet recital. The auditorium was packed with chattering parents and the scent of hairspray and nervous energy. I sat in the dead center of the third row, holding a massive bouquet of yellow roses, Mia's favorite. When the velvet curtains parted, my breath hitched. There she was, standing in the front row of dancers, wearing a sparkling blue tutu. She looked terrified for a split second, scanning the dark audience. I leaned forward and gave her a small, reassuring wave. The moment her eyes locked onto mine, the fear melted away. She beamed, her posture straightening, and as the classical music swelled, she began to dance. She was magnificent. She didn't miss a single step. I watched her twirl and leap, my vision blurring with happy tears. I remembered Richard's mocking voice, calling these lessons a waste of resources. I remembered him leaving for his European vacation, dismissing her existence entirely. He wasn't here today. There was no empty seat beside me, making me feel inadequate. There was no one checking their watch, sighing impatiently, rushing to leave the moment the curtain dropped. There was only me, entirely present, entirely devoted to witnessing my daughter's triumph. When the performance ended, the crowd erupted into applause. I stood up, cheering louder than anyone else in the room. Mia bowed gracefully, her eyes shining under the stage lights, looking straight at me. In that beautiful, triumphant moment, the broken pieces of our past were completely swept away. We were whole. A week after the recital, I had one final piece of business to attend to. I logged on to my secure banking portal, the screen illuminating my quiet home office. Before the divorce, Richard had gleefully established those trust funds for his sons, fully expecting my invisible holding company to bankroll them. Today, I was establishing a trust of my own. I carefully navigated through the menus, transferring the recovered principal investment and the accumulated interest into a newly formed ironclad trust account. The beneficiary name was typed clearly across the screen, Mia Eleanor Walker. I set the parameters so she would have access to the funds for her education, her first home, or her own business ventures when she came of age. I ensured that no matter what happened to me, she would never be financially vulnerable to anyone. She would never have to rely on the conditional generosity of a man who didn't value her. I clicked submit, watching the confirmation screen appear. A profound weight lifted off my shoulders, floating away into the ether. My boys get the trust funds. Your daughter gets nothing. Richard's final, arrogant words echoed in my memory, but they no longer carried any sting. They were just empty syllables from a lifetime ago. I had flipped the board. The fortune he had squandered his marriage to keep was now securely locked away for the very child he had tried to erase. The poetic justice was absolute, silent, and permanent. The evening wrapped around the house like a warm blanket. I sat in my studio, the soft glow of the monitor illuminating the room. Outside, the spring rain had begun to fall, a gentle, rhythmic tapping against the glass. I opened my editing software, watching the familiar visual loop of the water ripples play across the screen. I adjusted my microphone, bringing it close. I didn't have a scripted story to tell tonight. I just wanted to record a final sign-off for the series I had created, a message for the women who had followed my journey out of the dark. If you are listening to this, I spoke softly, my voice steady and rich with peace, and you are sitting in a house that feels like a hotel, loving someone who views you as a convenience, please know that you hold more power than you realize. I looked at the framed photo on my desk, a recent picture of Mia and me, laughing in the park, entirely happy. You do not have to accept the scraps from someone else's table, I continued into the mic. You have the power to walk away, to reclaim your worth, and to build a life where you and your children are the priority. It will be terrifying, and it will be hard, but the peace you will find on the other side is worth every single tear. I smiled, reaching out to gently power down the equipment. The storm eventually runs out of rain. Thank you for listening. I took off my headphones and walked out of the studio, turning off the light. Down the hall, Mia was sleeping soundly, dreaming of her next ballet routine. Our home was quiet, secure, and overflowing with love. We were finally, beautifully free.